va a ser en inglés. Y entonces a los que necesitan traducción, hay el sistema de traducción, o sea que si alguien necesita puede buscarlo. Well, I want to thank you, everybody of you, for this session. I will be very brief because we are already late on time. Actually, this is related to those that create problems with climate change. So we find that in many areas of the world, the production is not going to be sufficient and is facing difficulties. So trade is a very important tool to resolve part of these problems. And the session of today is just to discuss this, how exporters and importers view and find which could be the best solutions to resolve food security, and at the same time to find to what extent trade could help for that. We will begin with Katia Krivonos. The CVs of everybody are available, so we are not going to lose time. Katia is working in FAO, and she will make an initial presentation, and then we will come with exporters and importers sharing with us their views on how they see the future of relation between trade and food security. Katia, thank you for coming. So you know how to proceed. Ya está.
Hello? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much for introduction. Marcelo, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Katia Krivonos. I represent Trade and Markets Division of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, with the headquarters in Rome. And Marcelo and organizers asked me to speak, set the stage, explaining the importance of trade for food security, and to look at remaining impediments to freer trade and what can be done about it, and what are sort of the difficulties with that. I will mostly focus on the first two parts, so in food security and trade and why it's important and what the current situation is. How to resolve the remaining barriers, it's really something that's being negotiated on the other side of Buenos Aires in Hilton, so it's up to the countries. Of course, as FAO, we try to provide guidance and discuss the different pros and cons of different trade policies, but I really believe that this is the task of the trade negotiations, and hopefully they will achieve something. So as soon as I can get my presentation, it's here, okay, wonderful. I can just not see it here, but I can continue. Okay, so we'll have to look behind me to see what's on, because in case you can turn on the screen, that would be very helpful, that's in front. Sorry, it's wrong presentation. Could you please put? Well, in the meanwhile, I can just tell you that clearly food security remains a major challenge. So actually, FAO estimated that between 2014 and 2016, the number of undernourished people increased. So there is a slight increase, but in percentage terms, but we're talking about an additional several millions of people, as much as 100 million people who are still suffering from undernutrition, mostly driven by conflicts and wars and droughts. So it's definitely not a time to be complacent and to say that food security has been improving for several decades, so now we can just relax and it will continue that way. It's certainly not the case. There are many, many obstacles. There's still severe constraints to food security, and also considering that in many developing and emerging economies, food security is actually becoming more about obesity and overweight. FAO really focuses on all the sources of malnutrition, so not undernourishment alone, not the undernutrition alone, but also malnourishment and obesity and overweight, because it has substantial implications for public health, for social development, and so on. Now, trade will always be an important part of food security because countries, the imports that the countries undertake, they're a very important part of total supplies. They're never, the country never produces everything that it eats, so it's an important source of accessibility of food, but at the same time, and availability and access to food, but at the same time, the international trade is, of course, a major source of income for many farmers. So it's also important for their incomes and their food security from that side. Any progress on the slides? It would be easier to show some interesting things. I can keep talking, of course. Well, so I'll continue for now. The trade part is, what we're observing at FAO is that trade will continue being important, and perhaps more so because some regions are becoming increasingly net food exporters. Like, for example, where we are in Argentina and Brazil in the Southern Cone, but also Russia, Kazakhstan, the Black Sea countries, they're increasingly becoming major suppliers. So then their net exports are growing, while the countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, these are precisely the regions where there is economic growth, but also population growth. A very strong population growth, especially in Africa. It drives higher demand for food. So these regions are not able to produce all that they require, and their net imports will increase. So it's really a very stark picture of growing net exports and in some regions and growing net imports in others. So we need to find the link, especially in light of climate change, where some regions will increasingly suffer from production shortfalls, and especially as a consequence of extreme events that will, where agriculture will bear severe losses in some of the years. Wonderful. And then other countries that are able to provide supplies, so the trade has a stabilizing role, reducing risks, not just the actual trade flows, but also prices, preventing excessive price volatility. Okay, so I can now skip some things because I already mentioned them. The number of food insecure has risen somewhat in recent years. And here, the important thing to keep in mind is that it's not just FAO, it's not just UN, but it's also the international community overall has recognized the role of trade in achieving food security objectives, because as part of Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, it's actually a very strong commitment to trade in the form of a target. Under SDG 2, which has to do with food insecurity, there is a target that says that to correct and prevent trade restrictions and distortions. So the countries will strive to make trade more fluid, more efficient, more inclusive in order to achieve food security. I think it's a very strong statement. It's a commitment. It's a political statement. So I haven't personally seen it that strongly put on the international agenda before, linking so closely trade and food security. So I think it's important. Now, as I mentioned, trade plays an equilibrating role, connecting resource-poor regions, their demand connecting with the global supply from the regions where there is resource abundance, where there's good conditions for growing food. But there are some effects that are short-term of trade, and there are some effects that are long-term, and it's very important to look at them, because you could have gains from trade in the short run, but then in the longer run, some risks or even negative implications. So it's very difficult to calculate ahead of time what would be the full picture, because the four dimensions of food security, access, availability, utilization, and stability, could actually even be affected by trade in a different way. It could be different. You could have stable supplies in 1 year, and then if a certain policy means that there's greater uncertainty in the future and greater variability of prices, of supplies, then the stability pillar of food security is threatened. So it's very difficult to calculate ahead of time what specific trade policy, how will have the final outcome over time on food security. But at FAO, we try to guide the countries on this matter. Trade is increasing at a slower pace than before, but it is increasing because of these differences, mostly because of the strong demand in Africa and Southeast Asia. The share, I already explained this picture here on the left, is exactly what I was saying before, that some regions becoming net food importers, other net food exporters. And the other graph here on the right shows that the share of developing countries is growing in global agri-food trade. It's still a smaller share than the global trade generated by the rich countries, but it is growing. It's definitely where the dynamics are, both on the supply side and on the demand side. Now, climate change, I already mentioned. Most of the studies that I've seen, pretty much all models predict that there will be negative effects on global production. There will be short falls at some point in time, extreme events, yields, declining yields in some regions. So again, that just means that trade is not enough. We have to do a lot on the production side and the productivity side and resilience side, but trade will help to correct some of these imbalances. So the role of trade is even greater in light of climate change. And here are some studies that I referred to, but we don't need to go into details, that do show that if we have, considering these risks and declining yields, if we have also constrained trade, then the negative effects on food security would be much larger. So a freer trade helps to alleviate some of the negative effects. Now, also, the organizers asked me to talk a little bit about the barriers, the remaining barriers. So one thing, when we look at tariffs, of course, there is countries have undertaken commitments. Thank you. And there is developing countries have different obligations in the WTO in the form of the so-called most favored nations tariffs. They have bound levels that far exceed what the countries actually charge in tariffs. So there is a lot so-called water in the tariffs. One thing to note is that in developing countries, the applied tariffs have been gradually declining, but in least developed countries, they've been relatively flat. And now, actually, for all these three groups, the average tariffs for agriculture and food products, they kind of at a very similar level, about 14-15%. Now, non-tariff measures is something that's very often discussed as actually more constraining to trade than tariffs. And UNCTAD has done some calculations where they show that in all these categories, low, middle, and income countries, what the green part showed is actually the effect on the overall trade restrictiveness of the non-tariff measures is actually much higher than the tariffs. So this is perhaps where most efforts has to be made on the part of policymakers, importers, exporters, everyone. It's difficult to quantify, it's difficult to keep track, but this is a very important effort. And in fact, when we look at the work of the WTO Secretariat and the importance that the WTO as organization has, not just to negotiate the rules, but to enforce them, this really becomes critical. Because what we see is that after the Uruguay round, after the SPS agreement was also signed, the members have notified a growing number of sanitary, phytosanitary measures every year. But I'm not sure it's actually a sign of more measures. It could also be a sign of better monitoring, of the countries notifying more and being more actively involved in the SPS committee, in other WTO mechanisms. So it could be a positive sign that things are more transparent, and then you can challenge what your partners do with information, with reasonable arguments. There are actually few specific trade concerns raised in the SPS committee. This is where countries can discuss if they're having bilateral issues with some measures that their partners are implementing. So they can raise these concerns, they can get experts involved and see if there is a risk analysis that's made, if there is any arguments, if there is any justification to be provided for some of the, let's say, import limiting measures, they can be discussed and very often resolved. So it's actually a positive development. Developed countries play a major role, but developing countries, the gray area on the right-hand side, shows that developing countries are very much involved in raising the specific trade concerns. And it's good. It's important that they have the voice, that they have the means, and they have the technical knowledge to be able to raise those concerns and get them addressed. Domestic support to agriculture, of course, is an important matter that is at stake in the WTO. I will not spend too much time because I think we have limited time, but one thing I wanted to mention here is that when we look at the evolution of domestic support as calculated by CTSD, that actually EU and US are, of course, the countries that provide overall quite high levels of support. But if you look at the share of the value of production, these are actually among the lowest. So they're more on the right-hand side where the share is far below the 10% limit if we look at the graph here. And it's actually countries like Norway and Switzerland that subsidize more relative to the value of the agriculture. So depending how future negotiations would go, limiting the total aggregate measurement of support commitments or the relative ones, it would be different countries that will be required to cut their support to agriculture. Similarly, for developing countries, India and China provide large sums of support to the farmers when you count the EMS, the de minimis, and also so-called Article 6.2, which is for developing countries only. But in percentage terms, it's also India, but also countries like Mexico that in percentage terms support the agriculture more actively. So again, this is very important to keep in mind in negotiations. What do we want to target? Is it the monetary support or is it the relative support to the size of agriculture? Export restrictions is another very important area that is critical for food security. We have to address it at one point or another to make it more clear, more binding, under which circumstances countries should be allowed to use extra export bans, how they should interact with exporters, with the importing countries, and how to make sure that the least developed countries and net food importing countries are not negatively affected by that. As you can see, the peak of the number of export bans was around 2007, 2008, when the prices were high. So the exporting countries tried to keep their grain and mostly grain within the country borders to bring the domestic prices down. It didn't always work. In fact, it created greater volatility and uncertainty in global markets because many countries did it at the same time. So I think from the food security perspective, this is perhaps, this should be one of the areas where countries should agree and to implement some sort of stronger disciplines. Finally, just in terms of discussion for all these developments, I think we need to have at some point a conversation, how do we boost agricultural productivity and resilience without negatively affecting trade that is good for global food security? So how do you foster your own agriculture and the livelihoods and stability of supplies without undermining the opportunities of others, especially least developed countries? How do you do it without bringing the global markets into excessive volatility? And what policy space is needed and warranted for developing countries? Should there be differentiation between the countries, between the level of development, between the size of the agriculture? Because a lot of discussion, again, goes on the value of production. And then, let's say, for public food stock holding, how much you actually buy of that value, of the total quantity of production. So there are a lot of things that are details that will matter quite a lot. Like I said, I'm not in the right spot to comment on the ongoing negotiations, of course, but the things that do matter for food security is the discussions on domestic support, discussion of public food stock holding, and special safeguard mechanism, which is a tool for controlling import surges, and export restrictions. How this will actually affect importers, exporters, food security, prices, global supplies, and so on, it will really depend on a lot of these details that are under discussions, such as, for example, for public food stock holding, should these operations, whether or not they're challenged or not, should they depend on the scale of these operations? Should it depend on where this food stock holding will end up? Would it be exported, or what will be the final disposal of this purchased grain, for example? The different elements and export restrictions, even though it would seem fairly obvious case, it's still under a lot of discussion, who to notify, what are the obligations. So the devil, as usual, is in the details. Finally, WTO disciplines are very important to contain certain developments. Now we have a solution on export competition and export subsidies that are already mostly phased out by most of the countries, so with very few countries still using them. But the important thing is a deterrent. So once we have this agreement, since 2015, the countries are not able to revert to using export subsidies in a situation of low food prices, which is actually what we have now. So it is very important not only to look at what will countries change, but also what they will be prevented from going back to. So with that, I conclude. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katia. Now we will turn to exporters and importers. We will begin. We choose some large exporter and some not so large. One is from the US and the other one is from New Zealand. And the same in the case of importers. in which we invited somebody from India and to try to understand how a large importer also is facing this kind of challenges between food security and self-sufficiency or domestic production. For the exporters, I asked if they can they can tell us about which is the role that they assign to trade to deal with global food security in the next decades. Another question could be, from their perspective, which are the main barriers limiting a smooth food trade? Another question could be if they think that it's feasible to develop agreements between importing countries and exporting countries to facilitate trade and improve food security without what we already have in the case of WTO or other agreements, and which other trade options they find that should be developed to promote global food security. So Pam, you will continue. Pam is the president of the International Maize Alliance. The CV is already available. So welcome, Pam, and you can.
Thank you, Marcelo. I'm a farmer from Iowa in the middle of the United States and past president of the National Corn Growers Association, which represents more than 44,000 corn growers across the country. But today, as Marcelo told you, I'm speaking on behalf of Maizal, which is an international maize alliance representing farmers from Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. So my husband and I have been farming together for 45 years, and we grow corn and soybeans on our farm. Our families have been farmers for 6 generations. So just to give you a little bit of history, this is what corn harvest looked like in 1914 when my grandparents were farming. At that time, most of the crop went to feed livestock on the farm, whether it was horses, cows, chickens, and very little left over for sale. In the 1940s, our parents and grandparents farmed with tractors, not horses, and they produced more with better seeds. And this is my husband and me harvesting corn together. Farming is not just something we do, it is who we are. It is our way of life. We are blessed with very good soils and adequate rainfall and the knowledge passed down through those generations. But grand as that sounds, that is not enough to achieve success and ongoing improvement. We build on tradition and we make progress on the farm because we are able to access new research and technology. Innovation brings opportunities, more productivity, and better farming methods. And leaving the land in better shape, leaving the world in better shape is not just a cliche for us. It is a lived experience driven by a desired future for our sons, our daughters-in-law, and our 4 little grandchildren who farm with us. Turning to Maizal, this is an alliance of farmers who are working collectively toward a better agriculture. We are a partnership of 4 maize grower associations from 3 countries, which represent the major maize exporters of the Americas and the majority of the world's exportable corn surplus. While our members are and will remain serious competitors in the marketplace, we have joined together because we know we need to address common barriers to trade and challenges of adopting and using new technologies. As farmers, we recognize that openness to trade depends on the confidence in an efficient global trading system and confidence in the capacity of farmers to meet that demand. But we face many challenges in several important import markets, including the European Union and China. As Maizal, we have met with government officials and our importing customers in each of these regions to voice our concerns and to seek those collaborative solutions to some of the challenges in how we farm, adapt technology, and maintain our environments. All of us here today know the huge challenge that is before us. We must feed a growing world population. We must produce more food in the next 50 years than has been produced in the last 10,000. and we need to feed 9.7 billion people by 2050. We need to produce this food sustainably with less farmable land and water resources than previous generations utilized. All farmers will need access to the best tools and technologies if we are to meet this challenge. But the role of farmers in the Americas and in Africa is especially critical. Global food security depends on us being the safety net to regions in the world with less land available for ag production. But we all need trading systems that allow farmers in our regions to access new innovations and sell our grain wherever it is needed in the world. With the best tools and technologies, we can meet some of those challenges. In ancient Egypt, the introduction of the plow was a wonderful innovation for this farmer, a technology that eased back-breaking work with a wooden hoe. And farmers everywhere across every generation have always looked to new and safe ways to improve both better crops, soil quality, improved livestock, and better use of natural resources. In my lifetime, I have seen and been able to use technologies that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. And while GPS navigation, precision agriculture, drones, and big data might be more common on farms in the developed world, other technologies such as tensiometers for irrigation and biotechnology to improve seeds, reduce chemical use are more scale neutral, allowing even small farmers to benefit. All farmers across our world will need access to available knowledge, education, research, innovation to help provide tools so that we can farm better and more sustainably. However, I have deep concerns about the future. I worry about the opportunity to have access to future tools and technologies that will help us farm even better. I worry about farmers across the world being denied the ability to improve their lives, their farms, and their soils. I worry about the unprecedented attacks on science, innovation, and technology by professional activists who threaten to slow and even halt the adoption of technologies that could solve many of the issues that they say they're concerned about. And importantly, I worry about increasing failure of many politicians and regulators to support science-based decisions when looking at new technologies. Yes, I have grave concerns, and so should you. We have witnessed how ag biotech, one of the most benign and safest biotechnologies, has been demonized by bogus claims and pseudoscience, leaving consumers confused, worried, and full of fear. In 21 years of using ag biotech, there is not a single verified example of anyone suffering any ill effect. Yet ill-informed or deliberate manipulation distorts science and ignores real-life experience from farmers like me, my Mazal colleagues, and the 18 million farmers across the world who successfully and safely use the technology on more than 185 million hectares. Farmers like me have been accused by poisoning the soil, using pesticides. We have been accused of endangering consumers' health by growing biotech crops, of destroying the environment. Do people behind such attacks seriously believe that my husband and I would poison the soil worked on by previous 6 generations and destroy our children's future? Do they seriously believe that we grow biotech maize in order to poison consumers? Do they seriously believe that we set out to destroy our own environments? Do they think we are stupid? I am a farmer, a nurse, a mother, and a grandmother. As farmers, we live in the very environment that activists claim we don't care about. We raise our families on the land they say we are obliterating. Farmers do not simply grab any new technology and use it simply because it is there. It has to be fully and scientifically assessed as safe. It has to be affordable, and it has to work. We first grew biotech maize in 1998. Why? The corn plants across the US and Canada were devastated by the European corn bollworm, and at harvest our corn was a tangled mess. Insecticides could not control this worm, and the answer was in a better seed, BT corn. We tried this biotech-enhanced seed in research plots on our farm. It worked, and we adopted the technology. No farmer anywhere, large or small, will use any tool, technology, or any practice that does not work on our farm. The unprecedented attacks on science should worry everyone in this room and everyone who cares about the ability to feed the world safely and sustainably. In the past few months, we have seen chilling examples of how the denigration of science has been aided and abetted by political stonewalling, if not political cowardice. I'm talking about the EU's calamitous attempts to reauthorize the herbicide glyphosate. Since 1974, this herbicide has been used successfully and safely across the world by farmers, municipalities, gardeners, schools. There's been no verified human or animal health safety issue. However, in March of 2015, the World Health Organization's Cancer Agency, IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer, issued a report which ranked glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. To put that in context, IARC admits that using their criterias, also coffee, sausages, and sawdust should be classified as carcinogenic. Activists seized on this report and have carried out a relentless campaign calling for a ban on glyphosate. This is despite rigorous scientific assessments, over 3,000 peer-reviewed studies that find that glyphosate is safe. The European Food Safety Authority and the European Chemical Agency have delivered exhaustive reviews which have found no validated or significant relationship between exposure to glyphosate and an increased risk of cancer. In 2016, the UN Food and Ag Organization's panel of experts on pesticide residues in food and environment and the World Health Organization's Core Assessment Group on Pesticide Residues conclude glyphosate is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic risk to humans through exposure through diet. Yet, European regulators and legislators appear quick to listen only to the activists. Last month, 9 EU countries voted against approval, while 5 others ducked the issue by abstaining. This means that 14 of the 28 countries ignored the advice of the positive assessment of the EU's own independent scientific agencies. Last week, another EU committee on member states reauthorized glyphosate for only 5 years and not the customary 15. So this is a short-term fix. The same issues arise around the import and cultivation of GMOs in the EU. Just as concerning as the EU's influence on decision-making in the developing world, affecting governments, farmers, and consumers. Much has been made about the EU's precautionary principle, which is basically a holding position on any new technology pending further evidence. Sadly, in effect, it has become a halt sign. The selective use of scientific reports like IARC's to leverage and manipulate discredits valid science by presenting the worst case scenarios as equal to actual risks and known facts. This confuses and frightens consumers. The glyphosate issue is among the worst examples where fear-mongering replaces credible risk assessment in the approvals process. There is and always will be risk. I am grateful that we live in an age or in a generation where scientists can provide us with tools to evaluate and manage those risks. As a global society, we have to measure the risks and the costs of technological innovation against the risks and costs of no technological innovation. If we ban glyphosate, GMOs, and future critical innovation, there is a cost to all of us. I can tell you which future I want to see for the world and for my children's children. It is a world that embraces science, technology, and innovation to solve the problems of today and prepares to address the future challenges and opportunities in food production to feed those 9.7 billion. It may be easy to talk about hunger in the abstract, but not when you live it. I've been on farms and in villages where farmers struggle daily to survive and thrive. For too long, they have been denied access to better seeds and better tools. This is Elizabeth Fury from Zambia. I spent the day with her picking cotton and shelling corn. If I have a crop failure on my farm, my children will be okay. If she has a crop failure on her farm, her children go hungry. It is very clear to me, plain and simple. It is a crime against humanity to deny Elizabeth and thousands like her the access to technological innovation that she wants and she needs. This is a call to action. We must all see and act on the urgent need to enter the conversation, engage in policy making, and to champion science, or we will all face the consequences. As the Nobel Peace Laureate and father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, said, "You cannot build a peaceful world on empty stomachs and human misery." Dr. Borlaug said, "Get it to the farmer." He knew farmers need access to research, innovation, and technology, bringing the science from the lab to the field, whether you're on a farm in Africa, Argentina, Brazil, the United States. As farmers, we need to all champion what we do and why. We need to make our voice resonate across the food chain, in the hallways of legislatures, in the media, and most of all with our consumers, to reassure them that we are growing safe food for their tables. I challenge each and every one of us to take a stand to bring science back to its rightful place in the regulatory oversight, to respect sanitary and phytosanitary rules and regulations, and to refute unwarranted distortions of the facts. We need to rise up against the ban of useful herbicides like glyphosate, whose risks are understood and can be well managed. A ban would be the thin end of a wedge that would reduce our food security, have major environmental impacts, and bring untold disruption to trade. We need to move forward together in a way that serves the interests of all parties, to reduce the barriers to trade and allow maize to move efficiently wherever it is wanted, whether it comes from my farm or any farm in the Americas or across the world. It is in everyone's interest to have a global trading system that accommodates and encourages the adoption of innovative technologies. And it is in everyone's interest that a regulatory policy be science-based, predictable, transparent, not politically driven and unreliable. Farmers across the world carry the responsibility of putting food on plates. We want to farm better, provide safe, nutritious food, and leave our land in better condition than we found it. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll ask James he is working, and he has been working very hard recently because he represents New Zealand in the WTO in Geneva. So I think he must be very tired. I remind to every speaker that we should stick to the 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcelo. Thank you. And I'll keep it brief because I think we've got 3 speakers in the next half an hour. But thank you for the introduction and to the conveners for organising this event and inviting us. New Zealand has participated in a number of these kind of conversations in Buenos Aires over the last few months as we've been looking ahead to MC11. So it's a real pleasure to be able to be here again and to contribute and participate in these conversations. So I'm not the man you were maybe expecting. Chris Carson was supposed to be here, but he is over the road in the agriculture negotiations now. But as Marcelo was saying, I'm based in the New Zealand mission, and I've covered the agriculture file for 4 years, including at the last 2 Ministerial conferences. So it's an issue I take a very close interest in. So it's good to be here today talking about agriculture. And listening to the previous 2 speakers, there was a lot in there that resonated for me and for New Zealand in terms of the way we look at the issue of food security and how it should be addressed and the role of trade and production and so forth. And for New Zealand, agriculture production is fundamental to our well-being. It's fundamental for feeding our people, as it is for many countries, but also for our economic well-being, as it's a major economic activity, and we export a significant amount of our agricultural produce and fisheries produce, so it's fundamentally important to us. And we're reflecting very seriously on the SDGs, and we have a vision for our productive sectors to make the best possible contribution to supporting the achievement of those SDGs, in particular Goal 2. And when we look at the SDG targets, when we look at the issue of food security, we look very much at it through the lens of resilience. So it's very much along the lines of what's been spoken about before, but we think about it in terms of resilience of production systems and then resilience of food systems. And we've heard a lot of background to the challenges, the significant population growth ahead of us, the sustainability constraints around increasing production. And a number of numbers have been quoted this afternoon, and the one that really stands out for me is the fact that it's estimated we're going to have to produce globally more food in the next 50 years than in the past 500 years. And just reflecting on those numbers, it kind of sums up the size of the challenge we have ahead of us. But it's not just about producing that food, it's about getting the food from the producers to the consumers. And trade is fundamental in that story, because, as you'll be aware, the growth in food production, and food production is not always where it needs to be consumed, where the demand is at its greatest. So it really talks to the need to have efficient global markets, not just to move the food to get it there, but also to cushion the impacts of things like droughts, other climatic events, all of which can lead to food price volatility. So trade has a role in helping manage and smooth out those risks and so forth. And so this is why we think about the resilience of the food system and the resilience of the agriculture production system. And they're interrelated, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So in terms of the resilient production system, we look very much about the importance of research and development, so much along the lines of what's been spoken about already this afternoon. And so this includes areas such as genetics, soil science, infrastructure development, and the list goes on. And Katja posed the question about what can be done under WTO rules and under green box rules to support production systems. And a lot of these forms of investment, they fall squarely under the green box, under the Agreement on Agriculture, whereby there are no constraints, financial constraints or limits on countries and how much money they can spend in these areas. So there's a lot that governments can do to contribute if they wish to be investing themselves in their industries, in research and development and infrastructure and so on. There's a great deal they can do under existing WTO rules without constraint. And we do a lot of this in New Zealand ourselves. We have our own programs. We have the Primary Growth Partnership, as we call it, which is about helping our industry find technological fixes to problems that they face. And we also work, but beyond our shores as well. We're a participant in the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. So this is about trying to both increase productivity in agriculture, but while also trying to address climate change in terms of mitigating, reducing carbon emissions from agriculture, which is a significant issue. And so this program focuses on the emissions from rice paddies, livestock and cropping, as well as the issue of improved soil health. And the work of the GIA was recently recognised by the G20, and we're hoping very much they can support Argentina's priorities for the G20 in the coming year in 2018. So coming back to the concept of resilient global food systems, it's really we've really got the challenge of food systems relying on a diversity of products being produced in a diversity of location. And this is coming back to the basic principle of comparative advantage. We have to work off of countries' comparative advantages, and that means that food needs to be able to move between countries, within countries, to get to the places where it's needed. And so the need for a functioning trading system and functioning rules is absolutely fundamental to this. And we have the WTO rules now, extremely important. for many of the reasons pointed out already, but they are also very much lacking because you have persistently high subsidies, you have persistently high tariffs, and then you have persistent non-tariff barriers as well, and these were summarised very accurately earlier. So coming to one of your questions, Marcelo, about whether we can have further agreements between countries, I think the answer is we must have further agreements between countries, but yes, we can, and MC10 was an example of that on export subsidy elimination, but we certainly got a lot more work to do, and so the work going on down the road, the conversations going on now on agriculture are going to be fundamental to all of this. So we have, for example, just to give you a few more examples, we've got the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which came into effect just recently. So the implementation of this is going to be very important in the food sector to help it keep moving food across borders. And then, and as I say, the issues like non-tariff barriers, the use of the SPS committees, and so forth. So the use of the existing rules and better implementation as well as improving rules. So I'm gonna leave it there really. Maybe one last kind of observation is I think it's important to recall the difference between food security and food sovereignty, and these are not the same, not necessarily the same thing. And it's important that we move away from this concept of needing to jealously guard our domestic markets. And instead we need to better work together and think about how we seize the opportunities and address the challenges being generated by this significant demand that we have now and is only increasing. Because it's only that way, as we see it in New Zealand, that we'll be achieving the resilience of the food systems and the resilience of the production systems that we feel is so important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then we are turning to importing countries, and just to begin to introduce, I asked them which is the role that they assign to self-sufficiency and to trade to deal with food security, and this is related precisely to what you were mentioning. The second question should be if they find that current trade barriers provide a good environment for food security in importing countries. And another question could be if you think that it's feasible to develop agreements between large importing countries and large exporting countries that could facilitate trade in the case of large importers like Indians or other large countries, and also for smaller countries, which other options you should find to develop to promote food security in smaller countries. So we can begin with Bipul. Bipul is, I don't know if it's Bipul or Bipul. Bipul Chatterjee. Bipul. He is the executive director of an NGO called CATS International.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you very much for outlining these questions, which I'm definitely going to address. May not be in the same order, but let me begin with a clarification that India is in a unique situation in the sense that we are neither a large food exporting country nor a large food importing country. Our export and import, technically we may be a net food importing country over the last, say, few years, because we are importing a little bit more than what we are exporting. For example, last year in 2016 and 17, in our financial year, which runs from April to March, we exported about $30 million of food, and including plantation crops and marine products. And we also imported roughly the same amount, slightly more than what we exported. At the same time, it is important to understand and note that we are a large economy. We have 1.3 billion population, and food security is very, very important for us, as in case of any other country, I would say. Now, we have to also understand that there are certain objectives that we have as an economy, as a country, I would say, not just as an economy. For example, while agriculture's contribution to our national income has come down significantly over the last several years, and it is just about 15% at the moment, more than 50% of our population is dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. So we are talking about a large number of resource poor, smallholder farmers whose livelihood is dependent on the kind of agricultural practices that they are following. Now, in another sense, we are a unique country because if we look at the introduction of technologies in Indian agriculture, in some cases we found that, new technologies have been introduced, particularly by large farmers, whereas a majority of our farmers, they are still using very rudimentary technology, what we call subsistence farming. Therefore, food production is very, very important for our food security. Let me go back to history a little bit, and I'll be very, very brief. In about 10-12 minutes, I'm going to stop. In 1940s, early 40s, we faced with a large-scale famine in our country, which is known as the Great Bengal Famine, where millions of our population, they died because of lack of food. Not because of lack of availability of food. Food was available, but lack of access to food. So you have to keep in mind all various dimensions of food security, not just food availability, but also access, stability, quality of food, and things like that. And we cannot really distinguish in a siloed manner the relationship or the linkage between food security and nutrition security. As Ekaterina has rightly pointed out, that nutrition security is very important and is going to become more and more important in future. Now, one of the objectives of our national objective is to increase our farmers' income. Our farmers' income is very, very low as compared to people in the other sector. And the objective is to double our farmers' income by 2022, in 5 years from now. And we cannot do that unless we provide better price to our farmers for their produce. At the moment, the price which we are giving is not even covering the cost of their production. We have to also recalculate the methodology of the cost of production. And we have to give, as per the recommendations of one of the government-appointed committee, which was headed by Professor Swaminathan, who was one of the architects of our Green Revolution in early 1960s, along with Dr. Borlang and other scientists. So he recommended that our farmers should get at least 50% more than the cost of production of their cost of production. Therefore, this issue of, and of course from the overall point of view, also since we have a large consumer base and many of them, at least 1/3 of our population is still very poor. They also need subsidized food through public distribution system. Therefore, this is very, very important for us to find a solution to the public stockholding for food security purposes. And though some people say that the interim peace clause is good enough, etc., but there are problems with that. It's not just that we are talking about some key staple food, but also other foodstuff, which are important for the food security of our consumers, in particular, of our population. So we need to see how we can cover a large number of items while finding a permanent solution on public stockholding for food security purposes. And it's not about, whatever we are procuring and distributing through our public distribution system, we are not the procured stuff is not being exported out. So the kind of subsidies which we are providing, certainly they are not trade distorting in a sense. And definitely such linkages should not be drawn between the kind of subsidies which we are providing to our farmers, also to our consumers, for food security purposes. They should not be linked with other trade distorting domestic support measures. At the same time, we have to also keep in mind that we do have aspirations, our farmers, our producers, we do have aspirations for exporting food or exporting agricultural products, products like cotton, products like sugar, to export them to the international market. And that is something also you have to keep in mind, that as a result of trade distorting subsidies, we are not competitive on some of these products in the international market. So we have to have a delicate balance between various objectives. On the one hand, we have to secure food security for our population. We have to also increase the income of our farmers by providing better support price to them, by allowing them to do more and more exports, by developing their capacity to address sanitary, phytosanitary measures and various other technical barriers to trade related to food trade or agricultural trade. So it's a host of issues which we need to keep in mind. I'll also say to address this subject of trade and food security, I'd also like to point out that from time to time we do impose export restrictions on agricultural items. I mean, the purpose is to ensure that the domestic price of such commodities, they don't go up too high as a result of over-export, or when the domestic production, particularly when domestic production is not that good. But I do think that we have to have a good policy on such matter, on agriculture export restrictions. At the moment, our policy is we don't have any policy. Measures are taken in a very ad hoc manner. So in the past, I mean, few years back, we did a study and we found that such export restrictions, they do not really support or do not really facilitate the concerns of either domestic consumers, domestic producers, or even foreign producers or foreign consumers. So we do see that there is a value to have better disciplines on agriculture export restrictions. At the same time, you have to also understand that we are such a large country and diverse country that we have to also develop our own domestic system for better agriculture monitoring or management information system and things like that. So it will be difficult for us to adhere to disciplines which are being proposed by countries like Singapore or countries like Israel, though they are the core net food importing countries on export restrictions. So we need to see how we can work around Article 12 of the Agreement on Agriculture to have some forward movement on agriculture export restrictions. And the final point which I would like to make is that as far as key staple foods are concerned, like rice, wheat, pulses, other small millets, we do understand the political value of self-sufficiency. You remember that we, in 1950s, in 1960s, particularly on the first half of 1960s, we had serious food crisis in our country, and we were dependent on food aid actually, from United States in particular. And that led to a political decision to go for green revolution, which is not hybrid seed, but high-yielding variety of seeds in case of rice and wheat. Now we also have in pulses and in some other food crops, which helped us in not just in increasing our production, But also, if I look at it from mid-60s to few years back, within 50 years, we have achieved food self-sufficiency, and it has helped us in enacting a law, national legislation called National Food Security Act, which is a guarantee to our population, that state guarantee, that state will take care of food availability for the poor in particular. That is difficult for some countries to swallow, in my opinion, that within 50 years from being a dependent on food aid from some particular countries to enact a law, national law to guarantee food security for our poor population in particular. That's a big political statement and political achievement, I would say, which is often unnoticed in the development discussion, in the development paradigm that we talk about. And that has helped us in achieving many other political objectives. I do not want to go into those details, but certainly, for example, in early 70s, you know that we are in conflict with our neighboring countries. It would not have been possible for us to take a strong position on that crisis if we were dependent on food supply from some other country. So it's a political issue, it's a sovereign issue as well, rather than just an economic issue. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. While we prepare the PowerPoint for Jane, you just touched a very sensitive issue by Bipul for Argentina, which are export restrictions. Our experience are that they have been very bad for everybody, for the world and for the Argentines. So we find that, and when I was asking before which could be other views to reach agreements between importing and exporting countries, one of the thoughts I have was to what extent, if exporting countries commit not to put export restriction in the future, which the other side offer. Because I think this is very important. Actually, our experience in Argentina has been that export restriction didn't help also domestic consumption and price controls. They have been very bad for everybody.
Yeah, that's our
So we turn to Jane. Thank you, Jane, for coming. And you will speak for a smaller country, and not so small, but a view from an importing country, and how do you view self-sufficiency and trade for food security.
It's on. Okay. Thank you so much, and good afternoon. I come from a small country called Uganda in East Africa. And in fact, I'm going also to speak for a short time because we have, is it 9 minutes?
Well, we can do a little less. Do you have the...
I have it, but I was thinking given the limited time, I could just point out to the main points without using the PowerPoint, because my PowerPoint is about 15 slides. So maybe let me just point out the key issues, because also some other issues have been raised by the previous speakers, and maybe that's also the advantages of speaking last. Uganda, like I said, and like the moderator has pointed out, is one of those countries who are categorized as net food importing countries. But it's also a paradox, because statistically, we import more food than we export. And also because most of our exports are agricultural products, we have a trade deficit, a very, very huge trade deficit, because we import more than we export. And our exports, like I said, are both agricultural products, and our imports are also, some of them are agricultural products, but there are also other products like machinery. What I want to point out is that Uganda, in a way, is also a net exporter within the region. In my region, East Africa, Uganda exports to the region more food than it imports. In fact, when you look at Uganda in the East African region, it's almost the food basket of the region, because we export to the entire region maize, more maize than the entire region produces. So in a way, we are net food importers, but also net food exporters. And I think this is a challenge of how to capture data, because the regional trade usually sometimes is just informal. So even capturing that data becomes a challenge. Another issue why Uganda is also a net food importer is because most often, like it has been pointed out, Uganda has also been restricting export of food in order to ensure availability of food at the national level. This also shows that we are exporting more than we are importing. I want to answer the issue of the role of trade in food self-sufficiency. What should be the role of trade? For me, I think each country, there is no blueprint that this should be the role of trade in ensuring self-sufficiency. It has to depend on the circumstances of each country. In Uganda in the 1980s, the IMF and World Bank brought policies, the structured adjustment programs. And one of the policy was that we can ensure food security through the market. You know, we don't need to produce food, we can buy it. But because the market was not regulated, there was a problem. So if you don't regulate the market, then it's so difficult to say you can ensure your food security through the market. So the role of trade should also be considered in the way you handle the market. Then for Uganda also, our food crops are also the cash crops. For example, maize. You know, so if you say we are going to get food to import food, which is a cash crop, then you leave the producers without any income. You know, so our challenge is to ensure that the farmers produce food, but also get an income from that food. So it also becomes a challenge to depend on food imports, because you'll be cutting out the small-scale producers. I will leave out the current trade barriers. They have been addressed, but I wanted to look at trade policy and how it can be able to assist countries like my countries to produce. And I think what's really, really important is to have policy space, you know, for governments to be able to put in place various policies. And some of the policies can be trade policy instruments, like restricting imports, putting quotas on imports in order to protect domestic production. And that's why in the WTO we are now talking about a special safeguard mechanism to be able to do that if you have import surges, you can be able to put for quotas or to increase tariffs. Another policy area which is very important is the direct support to consumers, and this is where the whole issue of the public food stock holding is very, very important to help both the producers but also to help the consumers, because Bipul has pointed out, one of the key challenges facing our producers is the lack of a viable market. You know, today the price of maize is high, the following day because of market forces, the price is so low. You know, so this is what we need to address also to ensure that the producers produce and ensure food security. I'll stop there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the short presentation. We began late and we are already at 3. Just to make some concluding remarks, I think the first one is that until today, WTO has not been dealing with food security, and we have been negotiating agriculture without taking account this issue. And probably in the next agenda, food security considerations should be included in negotiations, and try to find out to what extent we can include in all the barriers that we are trying to reduce or to implement, depending on the countries. But look at this issue, that this is a major challenge for the future, and it's a big concern. We have heard from exporting countries and also from some importers that there is a lot of technology that could be used to tackle with all the food security issues, but a lot of them probably without scientific reasons are not being used as they could be used. So it is a challenge to find out to what extent most of policies that are negotiated in international markets could be, in international fora, could include the science as a basis for all the discussions. Actually, in WTO we have that because all issues related to the SPS agreement should be based on science, but in the reality, and particularly in private regulations, this is not the case. So we have a challenge because we know how to produce, and this is what we know in exporting countries and what we can do in importing countries also to improve self-sufficiency. So I would say, and to be very short, we have a challenge for the future, and probably, as was mentioned in the previous session, in the G20 agenda for the future, food security should be included in trade negotiations in WTO or another fora to include this very important issue to take in account when we are discussing just about trade, to include this other pillar that is as important that could be the traditional 3 pillars. So being said that, and I was told that I should conclude just now. So thank you to all, and thank you for the panelists and those who have been short.